back and forth behind.
My shoulder once in a while.
Eye roll.
Intro. All right. Hello, everybody. Good morning. We're just going to get started now since the clock has struck 9. Really excited today to be introducing this session. My name is Stephen Raitz. I'm on the conference organizing committee and really excited to be introducing a presentation that is really close to home for me. We were talking beforehand, and I actually live along White Avenue, and for a lot of people who have either visited Edmonton or lived in Edmonton, White Ave is just such a destination. So to be introducing this session, I guess, is exciting. The session is titled Re-Understanding Place in Old Strathcona. This presentation focuses on over a year of research and study undertaken by the Historic Places Research and Designation Program to better understand the Old Strathcona Provincial Historic Area. The message is to emphasize the importance of learning and relearning our understanding of places in which we work as planners. This presentation will articulate the importance of understanding which stakeholders are best positioned to undertake aspects of place knowing and place making, and we'll also discuss some of the benefits and challenges to conserving historic resources in Alberta. One thing I just realized I forgot to mention, this session is going to be live streamed, so we're live on online right now, so if you have any concerns about that, please just check in with our tech people at the back, and they'll just make sure that we can handle any concerns that you have. But getting that out of the way, and now hopping into the session, I'm really excited to introduce Rebecca Goodenough and Alan Rowe. And yeah, let's give them a hand to get started.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to our session. I've been told that the other session has Lego, so not to say that you picked the worst session, but you might have picked the worst session. But our charming personalities will win you over, I'm sure. So I'm Rebecca Goodenough. I'm the manager of the Research and Designation Program with the Ministry of Culture. I worked for about 10 years as a professional planner in both the private sector and the public sector before really developing a personal interest in heritage conservation and over time weaseling my way into the world of heritage conservation planning. So it's kind of a treat to come to these conferences and sort of re-engage with the planning profession. And it's also my first time in Fort McMurray, so I've always said that it's sort of I feel like it's a duty of all Albertans to come here at some point in time, so it's really nice to have been here and to be on Treaty 8 land again. It's been a long time since I've been on Treaty 8 land, so Thank you to all of those who have welcomed us here for this conference. So we're going to talk about, well, I'm going to talk about heritage conservation planning in the context of that in Alberta, and I'll introduce Old Strathcona and the provincial historic area designation that we have in place for that neighborhood. But we're going to use Old Strathcona as a way of talking about heritage and some of the challenges that we have. And then Alan, my colleague, is going to delve into some case studies within the case study to really talk about some research that he's done over the past year on Old Strathcona, and then we'll just sort of wrap it up with some final thoughts. So just out of curiosity, how many people here have had some sort of interaction with heritage conservation planning? A few of you, and is that mostly getting Historic Resources Act approvals through for projects, or is that related, or I guess how many of you have had experience with Historic Resources Act approvals? And how many with designation or approvals to designated properties? Okay, so there's a fair amount of you. So this might be a little bit of a refresher for some of you, but hopefully a new information for many of you. So designation is the tool that we use in Alberta to protect historic places. The Historical Resources Act is the legislation that we have in place that gives the minister and municipalities the ability to legally protect historic sites. And when we talk about historic resources, historic places, we're talking about those physical aspects of place. So we're not talking about intangible things, cultural practices, traditions, those sorts of things. We're talking about physical, tangible stuff. So this includes both works of nature and humans, and it relates to paleontology, archaeology, history, culture, natural attributes, science, or aesthetic interests. So the things that we designate are buildings, groups of buildings, and what we call cultural landscapes in both an urban and a rural setting. The Act gives the minister the ability to designate provincial historic resources, so those are typically specific individual sites. It also gives the minister the ability to designate historic areas, so that's larger collections of properties, larger areas. It also gives municipalities, municipal councils, the ability to do the same thing, so individual municipal historic resources or municipal historic areas. In Alberta, there are about 750 designated historic resources, and there are only 3 historic areas. So there's 2 provincial ones. One is in Fort Macleod, the other is Old Strathcona. And there's 1 municipal historic area, which is a streetscape in Medicine Hat, and I'll return to this later on. So things that we designate buildings, we designate cultural landscapes, we designate works of industry, we designate sites of archaeological and cultural significance. We designate paleontological sites. We designate extravagant structures. And I want to make a point here because we also designate fairly humble buildings. And I think there's a bit of a misconception that heritage has to always have this sort of architectural presence that's more grand, and that's not always the case. It's largely tied to significance and not necessarily to aesthetics. It can be, but not always. So the stuff that we can't designate is stuff outside of our jurisdiction. So for the province, that's federal lands, Indian reserves. We don't designate historical parks and villages. So if you've assembled a whole bunch of historic buildings from around the region and put them into a historical park, we would not designate that because it's outside of its original context. We don't designate small and movable objects, so machinery, equipment, transportation artifacts, furniture, those types of things. We don't designate reconstructions, so if the historic place is gone, but you have really good as-built drawings and you reconstruct it, it's not the historic place and we would not designate that. And then we also don't designate human remains. We usually do not designate cemeteries, birthplaces or graves, resources that have been moved from their original context, commemorative resources such as monuments, statues, cairns, and resources less than 50 years old. There are exceptions to those, which I won't get into the details of, but if you have questions, feel free to ask afterwards. So how do we designate? And this is, I'm going to try to capture this in about 5 minutes, but this is a lot of information, so I'll just touch on it really quickly. The process is essentially the same at the provincial level as it is at the municipal level. The difference is that at the provincial level, we're looking at a larger scope. So we're looking at significance across the entire province. At the municipal level, more looking at scope of significance to that particular municipality or region. So the first step that we take is to evaluate the site. So we go through that eligibility criteria that I just went through on the previous slide. If it meets that, we move on to determining heritage significance. So this is where Alan and his colleagues come in, and they do a lot of historical research to understand the historical place. And we want to make sure that it's not just old, but it has significance. So it needs to be associated with an important theme, an event, a person, an institution. Sometimes it's the architectural design, the materials or method of construction. Some sites are symbolic, and or if it's a landmark. So in Alberta, of course, the iconic landmark is the grain elevator. So something like that would also meet. So for significance, it needs to meet one of those. It doesn't need to have several. It can just meet one, and that would be sufficient for us to proceed. So if we determine it has significance, then we determine if there's integrity. And when we talk about integrity, that's the physical materials present. So we have folks that will go out and assess a building or a site to determine how much original material is present. And a place does not have to be pristine in its original form. There can be changes that have been made, but there's a threshold at which it's been changed or altered too much. We also look at the condition of it and whether it's something that is actually capable of being preserved. Once we've completed the evaluation, then we draft a document called a Statement of Significance, or an SOS. And this is an internationally used document, and it captures the significance of that place into essentially a 2-page summary. So it includes a description of the historic place, what is it, where is it, and then it gets into talking about the heritage values. So it isn't just throwing a bunch of historical facts and information, it's talking about that significance piece that we did in the evaluation process. So why is this place significant? And then it includes a list of character-defining elements, which are those physical aspects to the place that are important to maintain and manage over time. So the Statement of Significance becomes a really key management tool after designation occurs, and it's referenced when people want to come forward and make changes and apply for permits for the property. The approval process, I'm going to take a moment to talk about owner consent, because this is a big issue in Alberta. For us to designate a site, at the provincial level, the legislation technically does not say that the minister needs to have owner consent. In actuality, we 99.9% of the time make sure that we have the owner's support to move forward with designation. There's only 3 instances in the history of our legislation where we've ever designated a site against an owner's wishes. And that's because, first off, we want owners that are committed to the preservation of their property, and largely it's an issue of property rights and infringing on private property rights. At the municipal level, we have a clause in our legislation that we call the compensation clause. Except for one exception in BC, we are the only jurisdiction in Canada that has this requirement, and that's why we have 750 designated sites, and Ontario has over 20,000 designated sites. So municipalities are in a position where they are required to compensate an owner for any economic loss that will result from designation. So how do you determine that? Sometimes designation might actually improve the value of a property, or over time it will. It's a difficult thing to do, and nobody's ever challenged it. So municipalities are always in a position where they have to get a waiver of compensation signed by the owner before you designate, or they must come to some sort of an agreement to provide compensation. So a few of the larger municipalities, Calgary and Edmonton and a few others, do have grant funds that they'll enter into an agreement with the owner at time of designation to give them some sort of compensation. They might rezone and give them some new allowable uses. But before we proceed with the actual designation process, we have to get that owner consent in place. Then either the minister or the city council will issue a notice of intention to designate, and this is under the legislation, something that gets served to the owner to officially start the process of designation. Once that's issued, there's a 60-day waiting period for the owner to mull things over, for new information to come forward. At our level, if we actually moved against an owner's wishes, that's a period where an appeal can take place. Once that 60 days has passed, the minister will sign a ministerial order or the municipality will sign a bylaw, and then it gets registered on the land title to carry forward as notification for future property owners. So once it's designated, we need to manage the change. So at our level, if we designate, owners making changes to their property need to get our approval to the changes that they're proposing. At the municipal level, same thing. And the document that we use to help guide that decision-making is called the Standards and Guidelines for the Conservation of Historic Places in Canada. It's available online, or if you ask me nicely, I can probably send you a copy. And it provides a lot of standards and guidelines for how to direct how you make decisions using the statement of significance to make sure that changes being proposed are in keeping or not going to damage the heritage aspects of that property. So it includes things like repair something rather than replacing it. If it's so damaged that you cannot repair it, then replace it in kind. It allows for modernization of places. So it includes things like accessible access to buildings, that's allowable. Building code upgrades is allowable. New uses, additions are allowable. So I think there was once a time where we thought that heritage had to be sort of this frozen in place museum piece, but we want things to have active uses. We want things to evolve and be used. With respect to additions, because this is going to relate to Old Strathcona, I'm just going to mention the standards and guidelines related to additions. So additions are allowed, sometimes they're encouraged, but the standards and guidelines ask that it consider a few things. So if you're thinking of a building, the standards and guidelines say if you're going to do an addition to a building, make sure that it's reversible. So make sure that you'll be able to take off that addition without damaging the original structure. Make sure that it's subordinate, so it shouldn't dominate the historic portion of the building. And make sure that it's distinguishable. So make sure that you can look at that building and understand that the new addition is new. You don't want to create that faux history. And I think this is also a misconception that we want to always mimic history. We don't. We want to be able to distinguish new changes to a place. So that's for a building, but if you think of an area, if you've got a neighborhood, within that neighborhood there's going to be historic elements, there's going to be historic buildings, but there's also going to be negative space. So there's going to be empty lots or sites that have new buildings or a possibility of redevelopment. And we want to apply the same criteria. So we want to make sure that additions to that historic place are subordinate, that they don't dominate the historic character of that area. And we want to make sure that they're distinguishable. So we don't want to create false history. We want to be able to see that those are new additions to a historic place. So, Old Strathcona. Under the legislation, the Lieutenant Governor and Council can create a historic area. So they can set the boundaries for an area. They can also supersede the MGA. So they can create regulation that overrides municipal planning functions and regulate the height, the type, the style of a historic area. So in Old Strathcona, there was interest, probably starting in the late 60s, 70s, that people wanted something to be done to recognize this historic place. Efforts sort of ebbed and flowed over time, and this culminated in conversations between the City of Edmonton and the province in the early 2000s that resulted in, at the time, Mayor Stephen Mandel writing a letter to Minister Gary Marr in 2005 requesting that the province designate Old Strathcona as a historic area. Why did they ask us? Well, if you remember the compensation clause, municipalities aren't in a position where they can go ahead and designate an odor because they're not going to get consent from everyone in that area. So the request came in saying, please create this historic area, but please do not create the regulations that will supersede the MGA. So this is the historic area, and at the time, the decision was to focus on the early days of Old Strathcona. So this is pre-World War I, pre-1915, commercial development. So it's focusing on the architecture and, by extension, the early business entrepreneurs. And at the time, they walked around and they did a little bit of research and they identified 30 structures that met this period and seemed to convey historic significance. And essentially, they drew a line around it. So the minister agreed to establish the name and the boundaries of the area, but did not enact any regulation. And it was established through Order in Council in January 2007. So though it's a commemorative designation from our level, we still wrote a statement of significance for the area. And the heritage value of that statement of significance, as I mentioned, focused on pre-World War I commercial and social development and architectural richness. So the character-defining elements speak to things like the structure and width of the streets, spatial relationships between certain features, the predominantly commercial use, the form and character and style and materials of the buildings. So since that time, we've got our commemorative area designation. The province and the city can still go ahead and designate individual buildings within that area where owners agree to designation. So we've got 14 of that original 30, we've got 14 of those protected. The ones on the left are provincial, the ones on the right municipal, the ones in the middle are both provincial and municipal. So when we jumped into our research last year, we wanted to see how successful this has been. So Alan did a significant amount of research looking at the buildings within the area, but also buildings surrounding the area. And he established date of construction for all of these sites. And so this is a map showing all of the sites that fit that period of significance, that pre-World War I period. And you can see hopefully you can see the boundary in green. The darker pink sites are the ones that were protected. So those are provincial historic resources or municipal historic resources. The ones in greens are sites from that period that have not yet been protected. And then we also took a look at landscape elements because that wasn't really looked at or considered in the original designation. So we included the rail right-of-way and also a municipal park, which we think we can date to that period as well. So not bad. That exercise to identify the 30 structures and draw a line around it captured a lot of it. But in terms of area management, this was falling to the City of Edmonton. And so through their ARP, they have DC zoning in the area. So that's sort of regulated the non-designated properties over time. And so about 2005 or so, there were several redevelopment proposals that came forward at that time that created a bit of an uproar in the community. There were high densities being proposed. Some community members were getting excited about that. There was a few demolition permits that came forward. And this is what sort of triggered us to do our research, but it also triggered the City of Edmonton to undertake a land use study that they called Plan White. So that wrapped up about a year ago. I think it was adopted for information by council, and they're currently integrating that into the ARP. So that study has done some good things. It directs density to south of White Avenue, so tower development, high density use, it now sort of has some direction. It reassessed things like transportation and public space, and it also built in some new language around heritage. But what it hasn't done is touch the zoning. And we know at the end of the day, what matters is the zoning. So there is still blanket 4-story zoning, upzoned. The whole historic area is upzoned to 4 stories in a predominantly 1 to 3-story historic area. It also includes development regulations that try to get at following the standards and guidelines, but that don't mention the standards and guidelines and are really loosely written so that a development officer who doesn't have this whole context will look at those regulations and apply them in different ways. So we do get structures that are sort of that faux heritage look and feel, and we also get stuff that doesn't necessarily follow those rules of subordinate and distinguishable. So I'll talk about a few of those examples. So as in many communities in Alberta, there was a period where everything was built in wood. A fire happened, the city would pass a bylaw and they would mandate no more wood buildings, we're gonna do masonry construction. So this was the case in Strathcona as well. And as of a few years ago, we were down to 5 wood frame buildings left in Strathcona. At that time, only 1 was protected, that's the Strathcona Hotel. 4 others that were remaining were not protected. So one of them was this building called the Schrag Brothers Building. And a demolition permit came to the city for that. They came to us and said, can you do anything about it? Because we can't designate against an owner's wishes. The proposal was to replace it with a 3-story new building. At the time, we didn't do anything. The building is lost, so it's gone. Similarly, there was another 1-story wood frame building. Same thing happened. Demolition permit came to the province. In this case, the province actually stepped in. So there was the political will at the time to take action and actually designate this against the owner's wishes. The property owner ended up selling the land to a new developer, and we now have one of our most highly successful examples of adaptive reuse in the historic area. So this is the site. Many of you might have gone here for ice cream this summer. So the historic building is in white. You can see the facade there. If you go down that alleyway, you access a modern addition at the rear. So if we go back to our standards and guidelines, we talk about reversible. So this modern addition has been not separated, but attached to the original historic structure in a way that can be reversed. We talk about distinguishable. This is clearly a modern addition. It does not look like fake heritage. You can clearly identify that there is a historic portion and a non-historic portion to that building. And subordinate. They were able to get 2 stories at the rear, a lot of additional leasable space, 2 commercial bays and office space above, without damaging the feel to the streetscape. So if you're walking along that, you can just see, there we go, at the top here, the addition. But really, as a pedestrian, you're still experiencing that historic streetscape. So this was a very successful, well-done project. Another thing that's really important to the heritage value of the whole old Strathcona original commercial streetscape was that the post office building where Chianti's is, that clock tower had always served as sort of the dominant terminating vista of that streetscape. And we've had some developments come forward that have compromised that. So one example on the lower right is the Raymond Block. So this was the old gas station site that was redeveloped. Pretty nice development. Like nobody's going to want to turn that away. That's a really nice development to have. Mixed use, good density. But if from our heritage perspective, first of all, it dwarfs the post office tower. It is now no longer the terminating vista. It has lost that. So this is not subordinate. This is the opposite of subordinate. And if you look at the first 2 stories of the commercial space and compare it to the historic building next to it, the scale is off. That's very much like a warehousing kind of scale, but new developers want that additional commercial height. So in terms of a streetscape experience, that's different. It no longer has that early 20th century sort of feel to it. And the height at the top is a fair addition, I think. I don't really have issue with that. But the way that it's been set back is not sufficient to really not impact the pedestrian. So it's overpowering, unlike the Tipton block where it was set back and it didn't impact the pedestrian. And then on the top right, we have the Mezzo Tower. So just behind it is Strathcona Garage. This is where the keg used to be up until recently. So this is the southern point of our historic area. This is the post office, obviously. And this was a site where a non-pre-World War I church existed that was torn down, and this is what's being built. So again, a pretty nice development. But unfortunately, in the 5 blocks of Alberta that have been designated a historic area, it actually has quite an impact on that. So I just wanted to use these examples, not to criticize, but just to exemplify some of the challenges that we have working with historic areas in Alberta. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan.
Thank you very much. So my name is Alan Rowe. I'm one of Rebecca's minions in the Historic Resource Management branch. I am also an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta and will teach history occasionally once or twice a year there as well. And I'm an imposter. I'm not a planner at all. I have no experience in planning, so it's been an interesting experience being here the last couple of days and learning a bit about that world. that is obviously important to what I do professionally, but I didn't really understand. I do have some roots here in Fort McMurray. I lived here 3 years. For those of you who were on the art tour yesterday, I was a one-man history department at Keano College for 3 years, from 2010 to 13, where I had the pleasure of teaching every type of history imaginable because they only could hire one historian. And then I moved to Edmonton in 2013 to take this position. So that's where I'm coming from, and echoing Rebecca's sentiment that it's a pleasure to be back on Treaty 8 land. So a little bit of background on what I do and how I sort of conceive it. I'm what's known as a public historian. And a public historian, basically, there's all sorts of definitions, but basically the simplest definition is the application or presentation of history outside of the academic setting, right? So it could take the form of museums, that's the most common type of public history, archives where you present or you preserve documents and such, oral history projects that try and capture the memory of a community or a particular group. Heritage resource management falls into this category, as well as documentary filmmaking and such. The mission statement for public historians, again, varies. There's various groups of organizations where public historians come together, but I've always liked the efficient and ethical management of heritage. And what does that mean, and how does that inform what I do? Well, I think the most important role of a public historian, and this is where it blends with heritage resource management, is connecting people to their past. People have an understanding of what they value. They understand their family history, their community history, their organizational history. It could be a church, it could be a club. They understand that and they value that. So for me, the goal of a public historian should always be to connect those narrow understandings of the past that are deeply personal and impactful to larger themes. So you essentially take the big picture and you help people understand where their particular experiences fit in. And at a time like now where social science and humanities teaching is under assault by universities that have come to be conceived of as job training institutes rather than educational institutes in a traditional sense, I think it's incumbent on historians to prove their social value. Like, we have a responsibility to the public as historians who train at public institutions, teach at public institutions, and whose salaries, when they do that, are funded through public money. So we have a responsibility to do that as public historians. So that's what I've tried to bring to my work as a historian at the Historic Resources Management Branch, and I'll give you a couple of case studies here to illustrate that. So Rebecca touched on this briefly, the history of preservation in Old Strathcona. It was actually the threat of highway development that triggered all of this. In the early 1970s, there was a plan in place to basically wipe out all those old structures along White Avenue, to widen it, connect it to the high-level bridge, and make it sort of a highway. And you have to remember, in the 1970s, Strathcona is a blighted area. It was the seedy underbelly of Edmonton, where you'd have pawn shops and all sorts of places like that. So it was not generally valued by people who didn't live there, but people did live there, and people did value it. And they came together in the early 1970s to form the Strathcona Historical Group. They collaborated with the University of Alberta to do research on the history of Old Strathcona, and they produced this document on the right, Strathcona, the Asset of Heritage, A Plan for the Future. And it's a document I return to quite a bit. I think it's important as we're trying to understand historic conservation. What did they prioritize initially? What triggered this? What did people value, and how did they conceive of it? So what they did is they went through and identified 32 buildings as essential to the heritage character of Old Strathcona. And it's a really comprehensive document. It's foundational to what we ended up doing. So there were two sort of levels of protection that the province helped with at this point. We designated individual buildings as provincial historic resources under the process that Rebecca talked about. In the 1970s, about a dozen of them got PHR, or Registered Historic Resource Protection. And then in 2007, as Rebecca outlined, we designated the Provincial Historic Area, which was meant to be more comprehensive. So the consequences of this, I think, were significant in the way that heritage resource management evolved from the 1970s to the 2000s. First of all, we got solid information on those protected buildings. The 32 buildings that the community identified as significant, we had a very clear understanding of the history of those buildings, why they were important, and so on. Really good foundation. The problem is we didn't go beyond that. We didn't look at all the other dozens of buildings. And in that report, heartbreakingly, it says something in the neighborhood of 400 pre-1914 buildings in the Strathcona area. Most of those would have been houses. You can't walk through Strathcona now and find 400 pre-1914 houses. So in the 1970s, it was a much more comprehensive historic place. But the other consequence is this sort of calcified as our understanding of the area. And this is where I think, as the province, we dropped the ball a little bit. Our understanding of the Provincial Historic Area in the 70s was not really updated after the 70s. So when we went and designated in 2007, we hadn't really done the groundwork to understand how a bigger picture of heritage conservation could take place. So for me, in my job as a minion, here are the things that sort of come across my desk that informed how I wanted to approach this research. First of all, readiness to respond to development pressure. Again, one of the problems is we have good information on those 30 or 32 buildings, but not so much on others. So when we get development pressure, quite often it's, we have a demolition permit, tell us if this is important, you got 48 hours. I don't know, I can't do that in 48 hours. Just hammering down the date of construction could take a fair amount of time. So we had limited information on unprotected structures. We had to correct that. We had to be ready to respond efficiently and ethically to the protection of all buildings in the area. Reconsidering heritage value was central to this, and that's the topic of the session, reconsidering place. Architectural richness. What did we value then and what do we value now? Rebecca talked about the juxtaposition of the wood frame versus the more substantial three-story commercial blocks. We'll talk about that momentarily. But also pre-World War I commercial and social development. And here was the key. The questions I wanted to ask, my background is in social history. It's the history of immigration. And one of the things that we sort of understand about the history of immigration and the way it's been understood is that the narratives about national development have often been very narrow. They've been about white Anglo-Protestant men, for the most part. So the questions I wanted to bring to bear on historic area research is whose history is reflected by our existing designation and understanding of the buildings that are designated. It's not just, are there buildings out there we may want to designate? It's, do we have an ill-informed understanding of the existing buildings we've designated? Is it too narrow? Are there hidden histories there that we should be uncovering? What voices are silenced? It's the central question for a social historian, whose stories are not being told. And if I believe, and I do, that the ethical responsibility of the public historian is to reach the widest possible audience and to help everybody understand their history, then we need to figure out what voices are being silenced and how we can bring those to the forefront. And how can heritage resource management respect them? And that's a challenge too, because a lot of these more isolated communities didn't leave the same structural footprint, right? We're dealing with management of built structures. What if certain communities didn't leave built structures? How can we incorporate their history into heritage resource management? So the research goals were twofold. One, get as much information we could on every building in the area, and two, understand a broader contextual history of Strathcona, because the other problem is there hadn't been major significant research on Strathcona's history since the 70s either. There was an MA thesis in 1978 by John Gilpin, which was excellent for 1978, but it asked the questions historians were interested in 1978. It wasn't that interested in the history of women, the history of immigrants, and the history of Indigenous people or the working class. And that's fine, because it was the 1970s. That's what historians did. But our understanding of history has evolved since then. So how can our understanding of the provincial historic area and management of it catch up? So here's what we did. We did detailed research on 240 buildings within the larger, I'll put the map up showing the boundary momentarily. And the goal here was to get baseline information on 240 structures. And this form here is what we filled out for each one of those. We now have a nice thick binder that has baseline information. It has information on date of construction, variations in the address, because White Avenue is a nightmare. Their address has changed multiple times, so sometimes buildings would have multiple addresses. So you need to make sure you have all your ducks in a row with that to understand that the disappearance of an address in the Henderson's directory doesn't necessarily mean the building was torn down, it just changed its address for a year or two. So we look for historic photos, we look for fire insurance maps, which I'll put up in a minute in case you're not familiar with them, city directories, and newspapers. And the goal is the baseline information on each historic structure, gather significant information on occupancy to uncover the hidden histories. And this is at the bottom. It doesn't show up, but basically one of the most tedious parts was going through city directories from the time the building was built right through till 1970 was our cutoff date. Who lived there, what businesses operated out of there, and how could that inform our understanding of the history of the building? And also understanding how evolving use of structures reflected changes to Strathcona's economy and society. So how can each individual building tell us a little bit more about the larger history of the Strathcona area, right? So that was number one priority. This is a fire insurance map. In case you haven't seen them, they're delightful to look through. For Edmonton, we only have them for 1913, 1954, and then parts of other parts of Edmonton in the 60s. But basically, this is White Avenue, 82nd Ave. The yellow buildings are wood frame. The pink buildings are masonry. So they're either brick or, well, mostly, almost entirely brick. This isn't Calgary, so there's no sandstone. And then it has the addresses, and it has the occupant, and it also shows how many levels. This is a two-story. This is the Strathcona garage, which isn't the size of a full city block. I've just blown that one up from over here. I guess I should have made that a little more clear. So there was a giant building right in the middle of the railway tracks in 1913. So it shows, it helps us understand the footprint of the building, has it evolved since it was originally built. So fire insurance maps are essential, and we're blessed by the fact that we have one for 1913, which is basically prime time for Strathcona development. The majority of the big commercial buildings that are left were built between 1910 and 13. So this is, we couldn't ask for a better date for a fire insurance map. If you haven't seen city directories, this is what they look like. So these are in place for Edmonton since 1908. Frustratingly, they don't go back beyond that. So if we trace occupancy of a building back to 1908, we're very limited in our ability to trace it beyond that. The Strathcona Plain Dealer newspaper, we don't have surviving copies from 1901 to 07, or no, 06. We have 07. So limited information. But to get the occupancy, there's two different layers to the city directory. You have on this side sort of a just like a walkabout. It's here we're on this avenue, and if you go to here, here's all the buildings that are in place, and you get vacancies, and you get new store, which is always helpful because it tells us that was built there. And if you go down on this side, you can look people up, sort of like a telephone book, except people didn't have telephones at this point. When you get to the 40s, it's quite adorable because you get a little bell next to people who actually had telephones. It's kind of fun. But you get their jobs, which helps you understand a little bit about who's living in particular areas. So stenographer, laborer, teamster, principal, wheat buyer, caretaker, etc. So city directories are essential to this. And for the contextual analysis, what do we want? Well, we want an academic literature review because, again, we're trying to connect an academic understanding of Alberta's history and Strathcona's history. And again, since we haven't had an update since the 1970s, we want to know about what do historians know about urban history since the 70s. particularly the history of ethnicity, the history of women, and social class. And of course, Indigenous history would be part of this, and there's a recognition on our part that what we're doing is looking at the history of colonial settlement effectively in Strathcona, and that underneath all that, there's a history of dispossession of Indigenous people. We acknowledge that, but because we're dealing with built structures, it's almost by definition we're dealing with colonial settlement. So the goal is, how does academic history changed? The primary source research, we had 1911 and 1921 census. I gathered about 1,000 data points from each one to get a sense of where are people from? What's their religion? What year did they immigrate? Are there concentrated neighborhoods in Strathcona of particular immigrant groups? That hadn't been done before. Newspapers and archival collections of relevant organizations, churches, the Orange Order, women's societies, and things like that. And then the key, because again, returning to the sort of mandate of the public historian, find community groups that have a particular understanding of their community's past or their society or organization, and how does my bigger picture research connect with their understanding of place, and how can we bring those two things together? Because ultimately, heritage resource management is much more successful if you give the maximum number of people a stake in it. Right? If you engage people and make them understand how their particular understanding of history aligns with the preservation of structures. So here's the map. Rebecca's already shown the green map that has the provincial historic area boundaries. The red map is where I collected building information. So you can see it stretches on White Avenue, 2 blocks to the east, 3 blocks to the west, and a little bit south and a little bit north. So the idea there, just getting a bigger picture of the development of Strathcona, and then for the actual research into the census and such, breaking the area into 4 quadrants plus a commercial core where I could collect demographic data from the census and try and get an understanding of what each neighborhood was like. Because of course the commercial core that we're focused on is just part of the story. There's a larger residential history here that served, or the commercial core served that larger residential area. Broad contextual conclusions from this research. The first one I already knew, but we finally had the data to confirm it. Our current designation of the Old Strathcona Provincial Historic Area privileges a narrow understanding of the area's history, and that understanding is Anglo-Canadian, meaning either immigrants from Britain or migrants from Ontario, Eastern Canada, such. Anglo-Canadian, male, and elite. The buildings that we protected, the story that we're telling about Alberta's past through the Old Strathcona PHA is narrow and isolated, and that reflects the work historians were doing in the 1970s, right? That's all they were interested in. They weren't asking other questions, but it's incumbent on us to ask those questions now. Our current boundary splits at a historic commercial ribbon along White Avenue in half, and I'll just skip back to this slide. You see the green boundary ends at the railway tracks, which is sensible, but if you go 2 blocks east, there's a vibrant commercial area here east of the railroad tracks. Now, it tended to service the immigrant populations. It tended to service less spectacular stores, shall we say, but that tells an interesting story in its own right. And in fact, by creating a north-south boundary, we're cutting an east-west axis that was historically significant. 3, the old Strathcona Provincial Historic Area has been viewed typically in isolation, and we hadn't explored the connections that Strathcona, the town, had to its rural hinterland. This could be farmers to the east and to the south of Strathcona. This could be the connections north that Strathcona businessmen always wanted to develop. But how do we understand the connections between metropolis and hinterland? And the period of significance, which we had to pick a period of significance, right? And 1914 is a sensible one from an architectural perspective, because that's when most of the buildings, like there's a real dearth of construction after 1914. It just dries up. And then there's a bit of a flurry after World War II. So by cutting off our provincial historic area time of significance in 1914, we're negating a larger history. And if you actually look at Strathcona in the 40s and 50s, It's reflective of what's happening all around the province. You start getting oil and gas companies. You start getting light industry changes to automotive repair, right? The influence of automobiles and transportation corridors and such. So there's a larger story to be told. Now, in the 1970s, no one cared about that because buildings built in 1948 or 1953 were not historic in 1970, right? But this is 2019. Some of these buildings that were built in 1950 are, they're 70 years old. That's not, it fits within our 50-year mandate for what it constitutes a historic building. So we want to understand that a little better. So my case studies. I'm going to give you 2 case studies that show how uncovering hidden histories can help us better understand the area. The first is the Hulbert Block. And for those of you who live down there, I'm sure you know the Hulbert Block and Block 1912. Outstanding desserts. Outstanding. It was built pretty much at the corner of the heart of Strathcona on Main Street and White Avenue, Calgary Trail now. So you've got the Mills Block on the end, you've got the Hulbert Block there, and the Tipton Block right next to it. And these 2 buildings sort of reflect that period of frantic construction of substantial masonry buildings in 1910 and 1911 as real estate took off. So I've got a plaque put up by the Edmonton Historical Society, and this is how the Hulbert Block is recognized. And frankly, even though this is from the Edmonton Historical Board, quite frankly, it reflects our understanding of the building too. So I'm sort of pilfering from them, but not pointing the finger at them because we essentially have the same understanding. But this is what they say is important about the Hulbert Block on the plaque attached to the building. It's one of several buildings constructed in the commercial district of Strathcona during the economic boom before World War I. A building permit was issued to Hulbert in May 1912 to build a brick store and office structure, hired a contractor. Hulbert came to Strathcona from Nova Scotia in 1893 and was a member of the first town council. He was involved in a variety of occupations, including grocer, implement dealer, and contractor. As a contractor, he completed several public works projects for the municipality, developed a number of commercial properties in Strathcona and Edmonton. He lived in a large colonial-style house, blah, blah, blah. So this is how we have, or the Edmonton Historical Board, but by extension, us and our statement of significance for the building, had identified the heritage value of the Hulbert Block. It was built by Hulbert. He was a rich white guy who built things, so he's a builder. But when you dig into the hidden history of the Hulbert Block, I think you find something a little more interesting. When we look at the fire insurance map for the Hulbert Block, you see Chinese restaurant. See Hulbert Block right there, 10361 White Avenue, Chinese restaurant. Now the fire insurance maps would usually identify Chinese-owned businesses because they were subject to different license fees, different regulations. Strathcona didn't have any specific bylaws, but lots of communities in Alberta did, dictating where Chinese people could open businesses and operate them and usually have to pay a higher license fee to keep them out of the town core. So finding out that there was a Chinese restaurant in this grand 3-story masonry block was quite a find. And if you look at the photo from 1912, you can see cafe along there. And it was the Empire Cafe. So that sort of became a hook. That's interesting. Let's look a little more at that. Well, if you look at the fire insurance map, you can see Chinese-owned businesses throughout downtown Strathcona. The green ones are restaurants. The ones that are circled are extant. So there's the Hulbert Block, and this is the Chapman Brothers building, which is now Famoso Pizza, if you're familiar with White Avenue. It was originally a Chinese restaurant as well. Laundries down south and sort of around the periphery. But what stands out here as so interesting is it complicates the pattern of Chinese settlement that's typical throughout the province. Typically, because of those licenses and bylaws that tried to isolate Chinese businesses to the peripheries of towns throughout Alberta, they typically weren't found in the core of a commercial metropolitan area. This is Block 61. This is Main Street, Calgary Trail. This is White Avenue. I haven't looked at tax records, but that block there had to have had the highest land value, or at least among them, in 1912, 1913. There's 5 Chinese restaurants in that block. It's right at the heart. So when we're talking about the history of commercial development in Strathcona, and we limit ourselves to Russell Hulbert, who came from Nova Scotia, built a building and sold it the next year, who's contributing more to the economic development of Strathcona? Is it the people who occupy the building and run a business, or is it the people who build it and slap their name on it? Well, let's dig a little deeper into the Hulbert Block. 1920, according to the Henderson directories, the Empire Cafe is acquired by members of the Ma family. Now, Chinese business partnerships in the early 20th century usually revolved around some sort of connection in the homeland. It could be a county, like people from the same county would partner to run businesses, but most often it was a surname, a clan. And the Ma family is the largest surname in Edmonton, deep roots in Edmonton's history. So we find out in 1920, you can see them, this is the first time they appear in the Henderson directory, Ma Chong and Ma Hen. They own and operate that cafe through 1963. And you can see this is a photo from 28, which is actually supposed to be a photo of this building. We can still see the Empire Cafe right there. So what do we know? We know that the building had a Chinese restaurant in it for 50 years, and that the Ma family operated it from 1920 to 63. And this is one of the largest Chinese families that had a biggest impact in Edmonton's development. So let's go a little deeper. Now, if you have a passing familiarity with Chinese history, you'll know that the head tax was passed in 1885 to try and limit immigration. And then in 1923, the government passes what was officially called the Chinese Immigration Act, but is more often than not called the Chinese Exclusion Act, because it banned further Chinese immigration to Canada. So from 1923 to 47, there are no new Chinese immigrants coming to Canada. The Ma family continues to operate and own this building. And then, when it's repealed in 1947, you get the migration of Chinese families. There was still limitations on Chinese immigration until the 60s, but from 1947 on, you could sponsor direct relatives and bring them over. And when we look in 1953, what do we see in the Henderson directory? The Empire Cafe is still operating, but look who's living in the Hulbert Block: Hondu Ma, Moon Ma, Fred Ma, Sing Ma. Now, this is circumstantial, and it requires a bit more evidence, but it sure looks to me like there's an influx of people from this family just after the Exclusion Act has been passed. So this restaurant is acting sort of as an anchor for immigrants to come over and take advantage of immigration after the Exclusion Act has been repealed. So you see the Ma family living in the upper floors of the Hulbert Block, all listed as Empire Cafe employees. When you go to the other part of the directory, which says what jobs they do, they all work at the Empire Cafe. And this trend fits a pattern historians have observed elsewhere in Canada, right? This happens all across Canada in the late 1940s. So, dig a little deeper. What else do we know about Chinese restaurants in Strathcona? Well, here's the Cafe Anne. This building is still standing. It's right across from where the South Park car dealership was. It opens in 1951, got a newspaper announcing the grand opening in the St. Albert Gazette. You never know where you're going to find these things. St. Albert Gazette is not the first newspaper I would have expected to find it, but there you have it. This is for 1975, so the Cafe Anne is still operating. And what must have just been an awesome site, White Avenue in the 50s with the neon signs all up and down the street would have been just awesome. So now there's no indication the Cafe Anne was owned by the Ma family, but look at the timing, 1951. What do we know? The Exclusion Act is repealed in 47. Chinese people start immigrating in greater numbers. Now you're seeing an expansion of Chinese business activity in Strathcona, and this is beyond the provincial historic area, but not by much, just by a couple of blocks. Also extant, sort of an ugly blue building in eastern Strathcona, or western Strathcona, the Hong Kong restaurant, which opens in 1966. Again, that's not terribly historic, but it is representative of a pattern that's happening in the 50s and 60s, right? And then we return to another historic building, and this is where, as I was saying, these deeper histories, if you take them past 1914, can change our understanding of an old building. This is the Shepherd Block. It was built in 1909. It's one of the older buildings in Strathcona. It's built before that real estate boom. Now, there's no Chinese restaurant in there before 1914, but if you take the history of this building beyond World War II, what do you see? The Maple Leaf Cafe, which is a Chinese restaurant, opens in 1949 under the ownership of the Ma family. So again, we've got ourselves an interesting pattern. Now, there's an opportunity to do outreach, and this is where I'm not quite done the research, but the Ma Society is the largest Chinese family clan association in Edmonton, and I've reached out to them they've actually written a history of the Ma family in Edmonton, which I want to get my hands on, but I've also been in contact with someone there who's going to ask the elders in the community whether they have any knowledge of these restaurants or their association. So this is work in progress, but this is the final stage. Once you've established your baseline information, take it to people who have a stake in it, right? And see what their perceptions are. And then you draw in new stakeholders that talk about how important heritage conservation is. So the hidden history of the Hulbert Block, the occupants, and I think you can see after this research how that initial heritage value statement about Russell Hulbert building the place doesn't really capture the complexity of the building, right? So the hidden history of the Hulbert Block expands and complicates our understanding of the building's heritage value. It offers insight into the history of a group that's traditionally been excluded in Canadian history. It offers a connection to stakeholders and an opportunity to really build upon new relationships to emphasize why historic conservation is important. And it draws an explicit connection between the period of significance, pre-1914, because the Empire Cafe is established before 1914, and the post-war years, because the Empire Cafe exists till 1963. This takes Strathcona's heritage into the living memory of people today, right? If you can talk to people who were associated with that restaurant and then tell them, it dates back to 1914, I'm sure they already know that. But this is research that wasn't done when we did our original designation. So that's an example number one. A shorter and even potentially more interesting one is Eastern Strathcona's Terrebonne General Store. This is a nondescript, at least the Hulbert Block was a 3-story masonry commercial block constructed during the real estate boom in the period of significance. This is a modest wood frame commercial building, and it's a miracle it's still there. It was built in 1910. So we have no historic photos of this building, unlike the Hulbert Block, which is a problem. It's almost impossible to find historic photos east of the railway tracks in White Avenue. There's a couple of photos of people basically standing on the railway tracks taking a photo of the streetscape looking east. But here's where you'll find Terrebonne's on the fire insurance map for 1913. Here's the boundary of our PHA. And it was not researched in the 1970s, right? Because it's a nondescript wood frame building 2 blocks east of the railway tracks. Who cares about it? Well, the first occupant, and they're not there long, but the first occupant is Terrebonne's General Store. So what do we learn about the hidden history of this place? Here's the Census of Canada for 1911. Now, I've contracted it. I've cut off a lot of columns. But we find out that in this building, there were 14 immigrants from Syria or Assyria. I'm not sure, anyway. Syria or Assyria. All immigrated between 1900 and 1908. You can see the year of immigration down here. So mostly 1901, 1902, 08, 08. 13 of the 14 people living in this store were Muslim, or as rendered in the 1911 census, Mohammedan. There's one Greek Catholic at the bottom. They all spoke Arabic. 13 of the 14 were bilingual. They also spoke English. And 10 of them were listed as country peddlers, right? Which is interesting because this column here shows salesmen as their job, but there's another column over to the right that's cut off here that gives you a bit more specific insight into what sort of job it is. And country peddler is listed as the job, which you think of like in the Middle Ages or something. Who the heck is a country peddler in 1910? Well, you dig into the secondary research and what do you learn? Well, the Terrebonne brothers were among the earliest Muslim immigrants to Alberta. They originated from the Bekaa Valley, so actually modern-day Lebanon rather than Syria. And this is what a book written on the Al-Rashid Mosque had to say. Peddlers had connected communities in the north early on through their treks with pots and pans, trinkets, and toys. They gradually moved into dry goods as families drove demand for clothes. As soon as the population grew, groceries became the principal commodity. So the Terrebonne General Store fits that pattern, right? It's a general store, it's selling groceries, dry goods, those sort of things. So it represents sort of a step forward for the community. But the really interesting reference I got here from Wow's book, there's an untold story of how these hardy pioneers linked up with indigenous peoples. Often they dealt with Cree-speaking communities that were scattered in irregular patterns across the north. Some of the Muslim newcomers learned some Cree and used it in business. According to Mahmoud Terrebonne, some peddlers even invented new Cree words to describe the pots and pans they sold. They learned the value of cultivating relationships for indigenous customers in the wilderness, for they could stay with them during the evening rather than venturing into the cold, dark night. In effect, indigenous communities became partners in a far-flung peddler circuit in the North Country. Certainly the success of the Muslim enterprises was founded on indigenous hospitality throughout the Northwest. So that's a pretty clear statement of what's going on and why there are country peddlers living in this store. And that's a hidden history of a structure that's outside the provincial historic area and had not been researched. So if you take the picture wider and look at the quadrant, the southeast Strathcona, remember I divided Strathcona up into 4 quadrants plus the commercial core. The Terrebonne brothers fit into a wider pattern of immigration and economic development in southeast Strathcona. So this is, for those familiar with it, the north boundary would be White Ave, the east boundary would be the railway or the west boundary would be the railway tracks. Based on the data I collected from the census, 74% of people in southeast Strathcona in 1911 were immigrants. 1 in 4 were born in Canada. 3 out of 4 were not. It's an extraordinary number. 53%, more than half of people in southeast Strathcona spoke a language other than English. Now, a lot of them were bilingual, but 53% spoke a language other than English. 20% of those were German, and I haven't included the German story in this in the interest of time, but there's a really cool story about German settlement in southeast Strathcona. 10% spoke Ukrainian, 8% spoke French, 5% spoke Arabic in southeast Strathcona in 1911. Now, this is a heavily working-class district. It's where you'd find light industry, for the most part. But there was a significant group of immigrant business owners, German, Chinese, Scandinavian, and what the census called Syrian. So that's a bigger history. And again, here the outreach is two-pronged. We have Aboriginal heritage specialists, and I've asked them if they could talk to elders and see if anybody has any knowledge of these traveling circuits. But it's an example of, and of course we have to do the same with the Muslim community, but it just struck me, what a fascinating story, and what a way to sort of connect Strathcona's history and also counter narratives about immigrants. Remember the discourses when Syrian refugees were brought in, and there were all sorts of there was a bit of a backlash by racists, and you could sort of make the case, well, look, people from quote-unquote Syria have been here since 1911, and they were a vital part of the commercial activity in Strathcona. And in fact, 5% of southeast Strathcona spoke Arabic, so, not exactly newcomers, are they? So it's an interesting story that requires more outreach, but again, that process continues. And if you take it further, we return to the Shepherd Block, again, which was where the Maple Leaf Cafe opened, a Chinese restaurant in the 40s. There are other immigrant businessmen from Lebanon. Elias Farah, born in quote-unquote Syria in 1901, the co-owner of Murray and Farah Dry Goods from 1931 to 44. There's a picture of him here with is the Businessmen's Association for Strathcona. And you can see the sign down there that's a window display for Murray and Farah Dry Goods. So that one little hook takes us back into the provincial historic area and offers new opportunities to learn more about the contributions of Muslim businessmen. So the hidden history of Terrebonne's, the modest building, and it is a modest building. It's hilarious to look at it from overview because it's sort of a hard scrabble connection of a whole bunch of little additions and such that have been built throughout the years. Whereas if you did an overhead shot of the Hulbert Block, it would be very singular and substantial. I forgot to put the image in, but it looks like a building that's been added on 4 or 5 times, right? It's like different shaped roofs and such. It's quite something. The modest building reflects the contribution of immigrant businessmen in Strathcona and the cultural diversity of Southeast Strathcona. It reflects the specific history of Muslim immigrants. It talks about the connections to the hinterland. How does Strathcona connect to the hinterland? Well, for goodness sake, you've got country peddlers traveling far into the north, possibly up around here, staying with Cree communities and selling their goods. And it's a reminder that the PHA boundary is artificial. White Avenue is a continuous ribbon of commercial activity. And the grander structures, the 3-story commercial blocks, they are all west of the railway tracks, right? But if you look at the history of commercial activity on Strathcona, East Strathcona has a story to tell as well. So that's my 2 case studies. There are more, but I've already talked for quite a while. So broadly, what have we learned? Physical versus intangible. Again, because we are in heritage resource management, a lot of what we do relates to protection of physical structures. Limiting our lens to the physical resources, though, loses much of the story. The hidden history of occupancy, business owners, they may not leave any tangible. There's no tangible evidence of the Terrebonne General Store. It's all been gutted in its interior. It's a modern commercial enterprise. But the occupancy, what activity was going on there, tells an interesting and important story. And we consider how many more Albertans will connect with Old Strathcona based on these stories. And again, that comes with the outreach. If you want to convince people that heritage conservation matters, connect their stories to those buildings. It also tells us something about the arbitrary nature of boundaries. Establishing a steady boundary based on physical attributes alone can be limiting. And the train tracks are just natural. You just, like, if you're going to put a boundary on the eastern part of the provincial historic area, it's going to be at the train station. It's natural. But reconsider that boundary. Is it artificial, and does it do violence to an east-west axis that is in fact historic? Take the time to research and understand it. Strathcona had a strong Chinese business presence that endured. It flourishes in the 1910s. Then with the Exclusion Act, it sort of goes away. It's not as vibrant, but then in the 40s, it explodes again. And Strathcona has connections to rural Alberta beyond the adjacent farmlands. But even those connections are interesting in their own right. And I'll hand it back over again.
So I'm just going to conclude with some takeaways. So I guess this focus and this type of work probably doesn't relate to everyone's day-to-day planning world. But I think we wanted to share this with you today for a couple of reasons. One is to just share the story of heritage designation in Alberta. Unlike other jurisdictions in Canada, our legislation isn't built into the MGA, it sits aside, so it's not necessarily apparent to everyone that this exists in Alberta. And also, I think there's a bit of a disconnect that, I want to try to build bridges with the planning community to share more about heritage conservation planning and the value of that in Alberta. When I did my education, there was no discussion of heritage conservation. I did a review of planning schools, this is probably about 6 years ago now, and looked at all the course offerings. And I think I could find 2 courses in all of the heritage planning schools in Canada that had something to do with heritage in the actual course title. I think this is probably evolving now, but it's not really something that we all necessarily are trained on in our education, and certainly in our work environments as well. And then more generally, I think it's important to just make sure that every once in a while we revisit the way things have been done. We all have, if you're private sector, you've got scope, you've got budget issues, same with government, we've got limited resources, but I think it's important to carve out that time to reassess and evaluate how we do things, to see if we can learn something new, because values change over time, and you might learn something. Also be okay with self-critique. We're probably doing stuff right now in our day-to-day jobs that 20 years down the road, future planners are going to look back at and say, what were they thinking? So it's always evolving, and I think it's okay to look at what we've done and say we could have done better, or now we can do better. So be okay with self-critique. We don't always have to defend our position years later. Also consider the multiple voices in the work that we do and who's not being represented in that. It's easy to forget the negative space, the people that aren't being represented, the stakeholders not at the table. So take some time to consider those other voices that maybe aren't at the table. And reach out to others who may be better positioned to act. So we're cognizant that our research has been behind the closed doors of our offices in our building. At least in our department, we don't really do engagement like I used to do in municipal and private sector planning. We don't do open houses. We don't do charrettes. Maybe that's something that we can move forward into, or at the very least, let's do outreach. Let's connect with the proper organizations and individuals who might be better positioned to use this information in their work. So for example, the University of Alberta, the Edmonton Heritage Council, which primarily focuses on intangible heritage issues in the Edmonton area. So I think it's important to consider that we're limited in sort of our expertise, and there's others out there that might be positioned better to take that information and run with it. So those are just some final thoughts, and that's it. So thank you very much.
Right, so we have a microphone set up for questions, so if there's any questions from the crowd, we'll be taking that for, the next 10-ish minutes, so we have some time still. You explained it all.
Come on.
Sweet, right on. Here, I'll pass this mic off to you just for the folks on the live stream.
It's just a real simple, practical question. Is there like an online resource where planners, from across Alberta can go and access some of this information and backstories?
On this specific research project, or more generally about heritage? Yeah, so there are some resources for sure. We used to, up until a few years ago, had a program called the Municipal Heritage Partnership Program, where we would actually provide training to municipalities around the province who were interested in setting up their own designation programs. So unfortunately, that program is no longer funded, but we do have resources on our websites that talk about evaluating historic places, setting up your own designation process, provides templates for bylaws, those sorts of things. We also maintain the Alberta Register of Historic Places, and this is a website where you can search all designated properties in Alberta. So you can search by municipality, by designation type. There's a bunch of ways that you can search, but it will pull up information about that site. It will include the statement of significance. So there's a few options there.
Thanks for the question. In terms of history itself, it's a bit tricky because the profession doesn't reward people repeating the same style of research. So we got a couple of really good community histories written in the 1980s, and then historians who wanted to advance in academia moved on to other things because just repeating what someone else did wasn't cool and edgy, right? So we got a couple of good community histories, but for the most part, the depth of research doesn't exist. There are local histories for virtually every community in the province, and you can go through those, and if you're looking for potentially interesting stories, you can find the hooks. Usually you can look through and say, okay, this is, this person ran this business or whatever. But again, the problem is those were often done in the 1970s, and they asked narrow questions, right? So, and that's been one of the challenges, and I've been very grateful that I've had the space and resources to do this research here with the province. I can't imagine how you could have the time and resources to do that, outside of it, which is kind of a dire answer, but it requires a lot of groundwork right from scratch.
Thanks for your history lesson there. That was fantastic. Just out of curiosity, what you've talked about really provides a real richness to what we see and think about when we walk down White Avenue. And I'm just kind of curious, what do you think planners can learn, or what do you think that the City of Edmonton planners could learn when they're dealing with proposals from developers on new developments? And do you think that this kind of enrichment of the history there can actually improve the type of developments that we see on White Avenue?
Well, I think the fact that we now have this understanding puts us in a better position to respond, where before we were being quite reactive. We were scrambling to understand if something was significant and why it was significant. I think the outcomes of this, if we're able to sort of socialize that or somehow connect it in terms of the interpretation and understanding of Old Strathcona, will hopefully continue to build value for that historic place. The community support for heritage in that area will continue to grow, and there'll be sort of an increased value given to maintaining historic characteristics in Old Strathcona. At a practical level, it comes down to regulation. And so with the zoning in place that we have, there's challenges with that. I think we've built some partnerships with the city in terms of how we might refer to each other earlier on in development projects, so that we can sort of meet with the developer. We're in a position now where we know what properties are for lease. We know what properties are for sale. We've got evaluations done on them. Often we'll connect with the realtor and sit down with them in advance of a sale so that they know our interest in designation, or that they're aware that this is a historic area. So we're trying to make some baby steps in that regard, I guess. Do you think else?
You had mentioned Fort Macleod and Medicine Hat. Are there similar, more thorough analyses going on with both of those sites?
So Fort Macleod is next in our list of projects, so that'll be our next research project. We've kind of established a bit of a methodology with Old Strathcona, so we'll be delving into Fort Macleod a bit more. It's a different context because they haven't experienced redevelopment pressure the same way, so they haven't been under the same threat, so we kind of saved that one to delve into next. So stay tuned. Medicine Hat, they have the only municipal historic area in Alberta, and what they were able to designate was a streetscape, a historic streetscape. So because of the compensation clause, they've kept it to road right-of-way, essentially. So they have a statement of significance. It's on the Alberta Register, but it primarily relates to the streetscape aspects, width, street trees, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Apologies, my cold is even worse today. I'm clearly going downhill. I just want to say I really, really valued that presentation in telling different stories of different immigrants in the Strathcona area. I've never even heard that before. I feel that in Alberta, our history stories are dominated by Ukrainian, and I'm sorry that I know there's Ukrainians in the room, but we hear about that more than anyone else. And I think there would be a lot of value for the province, and I don't know if this has ever been considered, to have a website where those collective stories can then come together, and they're not just being told by one people of this province. I'm sure it'd be valued by many. And I know when we've worked on projects in Beaumont, it's very difficult to find history about anything in that area except for told by certain groups, and then it's not very inclusive or a true picture of what was going on at that time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. And you've brought up sort of the what's the next step after all this is done beyond just heritage resource management. It's also about public education. And again, I keep returning to what I see the role of the public historian as. It's connecting people to their past, not just to gain more interest in historic conservation, but also connect them to narratives about Alberta's history that they may feel excluded from. So how we leverage that into public education is an excellent question, and certainly something on my mind. I take all this stuff as well to the history department at the U of A in an effort to sort of generate interest among historians there to seek out these public opportunities. And that's the problem with, I don't want to go on a rant about academia, but they're not rewarded for this sort of stuff. They're rewarded for teaching, rewarded for research grants, but the metric for career advancement in academia doesn't reward public engagement. I think that's one of the biggest drawbacks of the field, which is why public history can be more rewarding than the academic field. But anyway, you raised an excellent point about public education and how do we share this. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. I came because I'm interested in Old Strathcona, and in a previous part of my career, I did heritage designations, but I learned so much today too, so thank you. And just to build on what Eleanor has said, I guess I would say if the province can lead the way, but I think municipalities have a role here. Red Deer used to have a heritage preservation committee for many years, and it was citizen-driven, and then our council decided they wanted to have it as a council committee, and then they got rid of it. And that is where these stories came from. Really interested people, sometimes elderly people, but sometimes young people, researching these stories and as you say, have a personal connection to those stories in some way and bringing those forward. And so I think it's been a major loss for our community not to have that. And so I would say I don't know if other communities have committees that can bring these forward. They might have a historical society. How does the municipality work with that? And if the province can lead the way, I would say it's not just the province's job to tell a variety of stories, but it's our municipality's job to tell what is our story. So I would challenge all of us, I guess, to do that.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess I should mention, for a long time, municipalities I don't think even knew that they had the function, the ability to designate their own heritage. So the program that I mentioned, the Municipal Heritage Partnership Program, existed for, 8 years, something like that. And it brought that to the communities. So there was a lot of outreach under that program and training, and there was a lot of success from that program. And some municipalities have established very strong municipal designation programs. But with the loss of that program, we've lost the resources to do that connection. So we do the best that we can in continuing that outreach. I should say that there are grants available for municipalities considering starting up their own heritage program. They used to be under that former program. They're still available, but just through a different pocket of funding. So the Alberta Historical Resources Foundation provides a variety of grant opportunities, and there are grant opportunities for heritage surveys in municipalities, heritage inventories, and heritage management plans. And the management plans are essentially setting up a municipal designation program. There's also grants for research, so interested heritage organizations can apply to do research projects, heritage awareness projects, so signage and those sorts of things, or public education projects can get funding. And then also there's conservation grants. So when you have a designated municipal site, that property owner is able to apply for up to $50,000 annually towards conservation work. And if it's a provincial historic resource, that goes up to $100,000 matching annually for conservation work. So.
We still have a little bit of time for questions, so 1 to 2 more questions from the crowd, if there are any. Sweet.
Hi, thanks. That was a really interesting presentation from both of you. I was just wondering, is there a process for deciding which businesses are going to be put in historical buildings, just to keep that context in mind?
So for currently designated buildings, what kind of businesses go in? Not necessarily. I mean, the issue of use is left to zoning. So from our perspective, we just are happy to have something happening in there. Like we are open to new and adaptable uses to historic places. So I think, again, sort of that old way of thinking that, I don't know if it was I was telling someone earlier, there's a courthouse in Drumheller that was designated 1950s courthouse, owned by the government of Alberta, that was sold to a private interest and is now being condominiumized into residential units. So we like to see those kinds of projects. I think people should be open to that kind of adaptation, because to have some kind of activity in a historic place is so much better than not. So.
Thank you both for the presentation. That was really good. I'm just wondering, as a result of this research, and obviously there's a little bit more investigating to do and talking to those communities whose history has been uncovered, but is there now an appetite or a plan to expand that list of designated buildings, or even expand that historical area now that some gems have been found outside of the boundary?
Maybe. Amending the boundary is probably unlikely. To be honest, it's probably unlikely that we could get another decision from the Lieutenant Governor to expand the physical boundary. However, it's a commemorative boundary, so the ability to designate and consider heritage outside of it still exists. I lost my other thought. Did you have anything? Ooh. So period of significance, though. So that's the pre-1914 focus. That, I think, we can revisit. So we may go back to our statement of significance and consider extending it into, I don't know, the 50s or 60s, so we can capture some of those additional, the evolution of that historic place. We can also revisit our statements of significance and update them to reflect these new understandings. And moving forward, for future sites that might be designated, we can make sure that we integrate this research into that as well. So.
All right, so that pretty much wraps up all our time. So let's give them another round of applause for handling those questions so well. Just sneak to this mic now. But just to show our appreciation, we'd like to pass off these little gifts and notes from APPI. Thank you so much for imparting your knowledge and sharing those stories. Oh, I gotta make sure this is the right name. I got it backwards. Okay, there we go. There we go. Yes, so thank you all for being with us today and watching that whole presentation and taking in all that interesting information and stories. As per the next part of the day, we have about a 15-minute refreshment break, and then we'll be going back into plenary at 10:45 in Salon B, I think. Here. Okay, we're coming back here. Cool. So yeah, a 15-minute break, and then we'll